Good afternoon. Welcome to our Basel, Miami Beach, the second to last Salon talk of the day. I'm really glad you're all here. A proposition for living art. Great. And Reem Fadda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Spirito, for this invitation to do this talk. And I want to thank my panelists also for joining me. Here to my right is Khaled, who is an architect and curator, and currently also pursuing his PhD in art history at Columbia. NYU. Oh my God, mixed up. And then Omar Berrada, who is also a critic and writer and curator, and both are based in New York City. Omar and Khaled, I've had the pleasure of having them involved with me in the Marrakech Biennial, both as participants, curators and artists. And it's a collaboration that I'm very proud of. And the Marrakech Biennial is due to open soon in February, 24th of February, 2016. And there's a lot of ideas that we've shared together and a lot of kind of thoughts that we wanted to sort of discuss and bring out here for our public. I think commonalities and projects that might be of interest, even as a discussion, as a way to bring about some of these concepts further on. I wanted to start by thinking about the provocation of the title of this talk, which is this idea of the proposition of living art versus contemporary art. So we know that in mainstream discussions of art, the use of the word contemporary art is really what has been the coinage for quite a long time. A lot of people are saying it's the term that is used from the 60s onwards. And I think, for me, it feels now at this stage, having worked in multiple capacities as a curator and art historian, that somehow the term has to evolve, that it's not, it starts to have a lot of limitations. And this evolution is also due, in fact, because of many kind of parameters. A larger world we are living in, the participation of kind of multiple narratives of histories and art worlds that are coming into the shaping of these terminologies. And at the same time, multiple kind of centers in the world also contributing to this evolution. And the proposition that I have come about thinking about the concept or curatorial concept for the Marrakech Biennial, which is the title was not new now, and in explaining to people what I'm trying to do, I've come to the term living art. And living art being, for me, the difference between that and the contemporary is, for me, the contemporary is really about capturing our time, or it's about talking about the present moment. Whereas living art is really something that has provided within it something that is about responding to society, really as within that term. And at the same time, it is about the present moment, but it's an active present. So it's allowing for the activity in our present tense to be the thing that is charged in that term. And I think I want to say that I've constantly been disturbed somewhat by art that is static or merely just about form, especially that I come from an art background that is not just about form, and it is about content. So I think this is a good segue to start with both of you young gentlemen to talk about your specific previous experiences. I think maybe we'll start with Omar. And I know that you've worked a lot in Morocco in particular, and maybe you want to shed the light on your work, particularly Dar al-Ma'moun and that experience.
Sure. Thank you, Reem. Thank you, young lady. I grew up in Morocco, and though I don't live there, and I haven't lived there in a few years, I run a non-profit there called Dar Al Ma'moun, which is an artist residency and a library, and it's trying to do several things with, the geographical position it's in and the communities around it. This is outside of the city of Marrakech, so it's near a city, but it's in a rural area. And when we were starting to think about this project and about the idea of having a library there as a kind of resource for the artists in residence, it very quickly appeared that it was not enough, and that it's very easy, especially in the art world for some reason, to think that you're in the middle of nowhere as soon as you're not in a urban center. And in fact, you're never in the middle of nowhere. And so we've decided to figure out where we were exactly and to speak to those communities. One of the first things I did in terms of conceiving of the libraries is just to go walk around. And the closest institution to us is an elementary school. So there are children going to school, but in that kind of environment, it's a school with teachers and textbooks, that is to say, standardized knowledge in some way, but no library. So the only contact that these kids have with the outside world, and they're very near a big city, but they never go to it, is their teachers and their textbooks. And their parents are illiterate. In the rural areas of a country like Morocco, the illiteracy rate is 70% or something, and higher for women than for men, etc. So the initial decision was to have this library be not a library for artists and not even a library for students, just to be a library for everyone, to be a space where we could have the utopia of people being together. And I was just thinking when you were talking about the contemporary and the active time, contemporary means basically to be contemporary is to be in the same time. But I guess with Dar Al Ma'moun, what I've been exploring, I'm realizing, is the act of being in the same space. What does that mean? And maybe active time involves an idea of space, and I'm sure Khaled will talk about this because he is the architect. So the library has been, I've realized, which I didn't know before, I was always a user of libraries, but I was never a maker of libraries, is that when you're trying to conceive of a space of encounter, it becomes very rich in new possibilities that come up without you having planned them. And that our work has become, since then, a matter of being open to possibilities. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is that the first thing we started doing, before we even had built the shelves and received, the essential book collection, is we decided we needed to have a children's library within the library, because within the local communities, most of our users would be children because they can read and not their parents. And so we started doing workshops, reading workshops, storytelling workshops, art workshops in their school. And as a result of that, when we had our walls and our shelves and our books, the kind of symbolic barrier between their rural, poor environment and something like a cultural institution was already down. The wall was down because when we started working together, there was no wall. That is to say, when we had our walls and our big door and our huge shelves, they weren't too bothered because they had a relationship with human beings. They came to see these librarians, to meet other kids, to look at books. And what happened basically the next week was that a sort of small delegation of their mothers came to the library and said, well, we want to learn how to read as well. And that's one of the things that I was talking about when I said to be open to possibilities. I had never thought of that. This was supposed to be an artist residency, not a literacy program. But so then it was a question of when somebody comes and asks you, can you teach me how to read? You can't say, well, go find an NGO. And at the same time, we're not that kind of NGO. So you need to figure out ways to do it somehow or other, and to integrate it within your programs or to transform your programs. So that was one instance that was kind of an interesting way of realizing that if you open up to the environment in a certain way, it kind of opens up to you, and you have to then establish a relationship on equal terms. And the other instance that I wanted to talk about is we had, and it's linked to the Marrakech Biennial, because Marrakech Biennial in the previous edition asked all of our artists that we had in residence to make a piece for the biennial, invited them into the biennial. And one of the artists, Elin Hansdottir, who is from Iceland, decided not to exhibit within the main venue of the biennial in the city of Marrakech, but to make a piece out there in the countryside and to make it with people from the village. And what she made was a kind of piece of public art, a mix of public art and architecture. She called it a mud brick spiral. And mud brick is the material that villagers in that area build their houses with. So she made this kind of maze of mud brick and mirrors with the help. She learned from the villagers how to make the construction, and they helped her make it. And it was placed between our residency and the entrance, one of the entrances of the village. And it made us aware of a space that nobody was using, that was between, a space between. And that became a space of possibility in the sense that we had been involved in terms of the local communities with the children, with some of their mothers, but not so much with the population as a whole. You know, these are secretive villages. Their architecture is hidden. The houses kind of are enmeshed within each other. You don't necessarily know how it works and how to engage everyone. So we decided to use that space as a space of encounter by inviting, artists, scholars, various types of people to come and do talks in that space, invite everybody to attend and eat a couscous together at the end, all of us, and to try and make a conversation happen. The idea being that it was a challenge that the people from the village didn't really know what to expect because they'd never been to a lecture, basically. That's not, or a lecture. I would say the idea is to try and build a public space. And what does that mean in terms of who can speak and who can be there? If you're thinking of address or a lecture, the only reference point that you would have in a village in rural Morocco is, say, the king making a speech on TV, or some local authority coming to tell you something or explain something to you or chide you about something. So the exchange in public space is a show of authority always. And how do you try and build a space in which the exchange is about something else than a show of authority? And from the point of view of the speakers, the challenge for them is to come and do something that they're used to doing in university lecture halls or something, but to not assume that their audience knows what they're coming to talk about or even shares their language. They can't do it in French, they can't do it in English, they can't do it in standard Arabic, learned Arabic. They have to do it in Moroccan colloquial Arabic, which is never used in public interaction in Morocco, very rarely. So it's kind of like I saw it with the first speakers, and the first one was a playwright from Rabat in Morocco who had to come and speak about the notion of public space. What does it mean? And to create conversation about it, and to get people to come and speak about what they think it is and what their issues with it are. And it got into conversations about public transport, about school, about access to health, about equality between the sexes. It was interesting because a lot of women took the microphone and spoke. It had kind of unexpected consequences because as these lectures went on, fewer and fewer women were in the audience, and I'm kind of thinking that these have produced further discussions at home and tensions, etc. And it made us realize also that when you do something like that in public, you're disturbing a certain state of things, willingly or unwillingly, and you have to negotiate that all the time. I mean, it taught me something about site specificity, as it were. It's not about making a project that goes with a particular space. That's what our artist in residence did. But what she did was much more than that, is that she sort of let loose a whole process that's an unending process that needs to be renegotiated all the time in order for the relationship to continue.
I mean, I do have one kind of provocation to this because, I mean, it's very interesting how you're navigating with all these politics of a certain kind of art institution and the model of Dar al-Ma'mun being very particular as a library, as a residency. But then how do we really are able to navigate with certain politics of place, like a village, without being token, or like, what do you feel the general experience of that? Is it longevity that makes for? I mean,
yeah, I think it's the living in your title, in living art. It's the fact that from the beginning, the wager was to work. I mean, we don't only work in the village, obviously, but to have that as one of the main focal points, and so to work within a place, and to work within that place in the long run. That is to say, not weeks or months, but years, and to work within that space continuously. It's not an event. I mean, of course, these lectures were once a month, but workshops, whatever, everything is continuous, and therefore it makes a certain rapport possible, because you can open everything to discussion, but at the same time you're accountable, right? These are people you're living with in a way. And so, and at the same time, artist residencies, that's also the idea of doing artist residencies. That is to say, artists usually come for periods of 3 to 5 months. So if they're coming for a project that is to be implemented locally, they can and they have to take the time. And they also rely on our experience and knowledge of the place.
and it's also interesting, this dimension that you're adding to the idea that it's a lived space. It's spatial in that dimension. It's not just a coupling with time, but it's a physicality that is very important to how people really go about within their own societies. Khaled, now it's your turn, and maybe you want to talk about one of your previous projects or...
Okay, hello. So I'm Khaled, the architect and young man. The kind of work so it's also very site-specific, living-specific work maybe. It's work that's happening in Syria. In the past, I've worked on projects in the south of the country, and the project that I'm doing now with Reem and the Marrakech Biennale will happen in the outskirts of Damascus, in places where just being alive in itself is an act of critical resistance. So it's living to the most basic extreme, really, because what we have is a population that is subjected to immense amounts of violence in various forms, and many of which that we're familiar with from the news, like barrel bombs and mortar shelling. But in the space of the Eastern Ghouta, which is where I'm working, which is 2 kilometers outside, 3 kilometers outside Damascus city center, so practically part of the city, I'm working with Yassine El-Bouchi, who is a young 25-year-old, 26-year-old architecture student who's been stuck behind the barricade, and a blacksmith, where what we're doing there is we're trying to... so you hear about the barrel bombs, but what you don't really know, perhaps, is that there's almost a medieval siege that is happening in this particular geography. And so the regime has cut off the entry and exit of all people and all material, medical supplies, food, including the electrical grid. And so the population has developed this ingenious way of actually sort of like trying to meet their energy demands by either melting plastic, where they collect plastic from the rubble or from their garbage, and then they are able to cool the fumes that come out of, it's a very toxic fumes, obviously, and they run standalone generators with this. Or people like Abu Ali, the blacksmith, who's actually got sick and tired of this, and who one day just decided that he could actually build a water wheel using the metal scrap that was in his shop. And so you have to imagine this 3-meter diameter water wheel, a little bit less, that's running in open sewage that is sort of providing electricity for his shop, his house, and the house next door. And so I'm very intrigued by these kind of space-making, site-specific projects.
Could you also tell us how you came about this information? Because I think that's also interesting.
Well, it's all very personal, the way this work happened. So I met Yassine online because ever since Yassine got stuck, he hasn't been able to go to architecture school. And so what he does is he sort of operates as a photojournalist, sort of document the lives and also the deaths of of the people around him. And he has he had a small career as a photojournalist who then just happened to document this particular newsworthy moment of actually resisting the regime through the production of an alternative energy source.
Yeah. And?
So in a way, what we're doing in Marrakech now is, initially I approached Yassine and Abu Ali to try to do a water wheel together with them. But over the months that have passed, it became clear that the water wheel technology is somehow working very fine. So 1 year later, so this initial conversation happened last November. So 1 year later, there's now around 40 water wheels in that landscape. Some of them hidden between the houses, but the ones closer to the city center are in the parts of the country that have a lot of, basically it's a scorched earth landscape. And so they're just sitting there by themselves with wires running to them from them. And now we're building a windmill, almost participating in some kind of what I like to call a research and development phase of using similar technology to actually generate power using wind, rather like a wind to wire rather than water to wire technology. And then as an architect, but also as an art historian, like a wannabe art historian, I'm very interested in sort of ascribing this within a longer history of nation building in a country like Syria, really any place in the world, where the role of electricity or infrastructural projects in general are somehow utilized to actually produce a particular vision of what the nation should be. So if you think about like these great dam projects that all these kind of countries have, and almost provoke, sort of like place this giant dam that the Soviet helped build in the 60s and the 70s in the same kind of box as this little windmill that's produced by an architect who's in New York and a blacksmith and an architecture student in the Ghouta, and somehow try to understand this also as a nation-building project, one in which an imaginary is also evoked to produce a certain type of livingness.
And you're targeting these windmills to service hospitals particularly. Is that still the case, or?
Yeah, I don't really like to talk about the hospitals very much because obviously
Sure.
It's a threat of some sort. But yeah, the windmills are used to provide electricity for like public good, in whichever way you want to define that.
I mean, we've started to discuss these issues, and I think between both of you raising the issue about how your projects are, actually before I jump into my question, I want you to speak about your project for Marrakech with the Bou'nani archive, and then maybe we'll dial back and come back to a discussion.
Sure. So the project I'm working on for Reem's exhibit, for the Marrakech Biennial, is an exhibit around a figure, a Moroccan figure, a writer and filmmaker called Ahmed Bou'nani, who was born in 1938 and died in 2011. And it's his work I have been working on for a few years, personally, and in the context of Dar al-Mamoun. He, for me, is a central figure of Moroccan artistic modernity or modernism, if you like. I'm interested in the questions he raised, and I'm interested in the fact that his answers or his raising the questions didn't go as public as I would have liked them to go. So he's somebody who started writing and making films in the 60s, and it was a very lively period intellectually for Morocco. Morocco became independent from French protectorate in 1956,
And in the 60s, in particular, there were a lot of literary journals, new art forms, art schools, etc., going on. In the 70s, a certain kind of harsh political repression started. A bunch of intellectuals were put in jail from 72 on, after failed coups against the king, and so everything started to close down, and all the way I read it is all the questions that were starting to be raised and that were starting to generalize within society as intellectual questions, but also political questions. These were very much questions about democracy, about access to education, about left-wing politics, and about art. I mean, those questions were entirely enmeshed. You could not separate them, which is what I think is interesting about also this conversation we're having. So a number of Moroccan artists, intellectuals, writers became known for having been repressed and put in jail. But I'm realizing by discovering the figure of Bournani, and this is a name I had just vaguely heard about and only discovered his work for real a few years ago, I'm realizing that there's been another kind of silencing or of voluntary silence. After a while, this man, this artist, decided to not make his work public anymore. He was still writing and he was still making things, but only his friends knew about it. The thing is, after he died, and through meeting his daughter, who's also an artist, I realized there was in his apartment a huge archive of work. And when I say huge, I mean literally dozens and dozens of finished books in manuscript form. Finished as in not notebooks or notes or anything. That means separate manuscripts that were written, rewritten, proofread, edited, etc. You could publish 50 books with that stuff that's in the chests in his home, and there are, I don't know how many film scripts, I don't know how many plays, I don't know how many essays, I don't know, This guy's, the published work of Bournani is 4 books, mostly out of print. I republished one in the context of Dar al-Ma'moun, which has now been circulating. It's going to appear in English translation next year with new directions. So there's a new life for his work now, but he's dead. He was able to make one feature film called Mirage, and that is one of the, by everybody's opinion or consideration, one of the top 5 Moroccan films ever. He made a number of short films which are extraordinary, but the value and the amount of his unpublished work is something else altogether. For instance, he wrote a history of Moroccan cinema, which is amazing, which he finished in '87, which was never published, and we don't have a decent history of Moroccan cinema. So this is just to say there are a lot of cultural and political questions that have contributed to constituting what you could call a modernity in that part of the world, and that have remained unfinished business. And my project in this case is to open up a few of those questions through elements and items from his archive, and to ask a few young Moroccan artists from today who have not necessarily known that period of time to engage with those questions, to test the relevance of those questions, as I think they are relevant, through engaging contemporary artists with them. The artists are Ito Berrada, Mohsin Harraqi, and Sara Ouhaddou. They're not exactly the same generation, but they're all fairly young. And the specific questions from which I'm taking these bits of archive are two questions that interested Bournani a lot. One of them is the writing of history. How do we write our own history outside of the bonds of history, Moroccan history as it was written by the colonial powers, and outside of the bond of our history in terms of the official, rigid, censored, whatever, history as written by the powers in place now. And the second question is, so how to find modes of narrating and modes of engaging our own history critically. The second question is the importance for him that he explored for a long time of popular arts, popular, traditional, vernacular arts. The diversity of popular cultural expression in a place like Morocco, the diversity of identities, Arab, Berber, Jewish, etc., in the different regions of the country, and how that proposes a model for living and thinking outside of standardized forms.
I mean, super interesting. And I think there's another component that you want to do. I mean, if you also just want to highlight how you want to install the archive and what you're planning for the installation, because I think that's worth.
Not that I know exactly yet, but I can say a little bit. Well, there. So I guess one part of it is, and that's the work that has been going on for now a while, is to just figure out exactly. So I chose the artists with an idea in mind, but then I didn't necessarily want to just impose on them. So you read this manuscript and you do something with it. It's been a process of introducing Bouanani's life and work to them. They knew it to different degrees. One of them didn't know anything about Bouanani. One of them knew the film work quite well. One of them had an idea. So to try and find intersections, to try and find a possible terrain of engagement, so an intersection between their interests and his work. So, I don't know, Ito Berrada is going to be working with poems in vernacular Moroccan Arabic from the 16th century that were poems by this poet called Majdoub, who was an itinerant poet. And they're these oral poems, very short, that have almost a proverb quality to them, but a kind of a cheeky proverb quality to them. In terms of his relation to power, in terms of his relation to money, in terms of his relation to, I don't know, women, all of that. And with Ito, we've been having a lot of conversations about this and what it means to, because Bouanani had this project of, he wrote in French, and we have this manuscript of his translations of these poems that was never published, and his writings on this figure of the itinerant subversive poet. And one of the things in terms of public space, for instance, in Morocco, is that there's a taboo on colloquial language in the written or public sphere, but it has been sort of breached through publicity. So now the oral, the vernacular, colloquial language, some of the rare instances that you see it written or printed is on billboards, and it's basically cell phone operator little anthems or ads. So we're kind of wondering about the idea of why not, occupying that public space of inscription with this old poetry that still has relevance.
Maybe talk about the archive, about how you want to display it and what.
Well, they're different. I don't have a strategy that's set. I want to display in each case, in each of the artists, some of the archive with their work and create a physical dialogue there. But I also want to try and bring Bouanani's library within the exhibition space as a way to bring his world into the exhibition space, the books he lived with, because since he was retired from the world for at least the latter part of his life, he was living among a few friends and his family and a lot of books. And I'm interested in, some of you will know this text by Walter Benjamin, Unpacking My Library, where he lists all his books in his library and talks about the process of collecting books and reading. And I'm interested in unpacking Bouanani's library to see what was the book world of a Moroccan intellectual and artist from the 60s on. And so there's that, and to not exhibit it as a work of art, but to exhibit it in a context where people can just go and take a book and read it, to open it up to people, but also to catalog it throughout the exhibit. That is to say that would be a kind of performance, if you like, where several times a week you'd have librarians from Dar al-Ma'moun, but also volunteers, who would sit there and catalog the book. So continuously through the 3 months of the exhibit, at the end, and this would be also a contribution to the preserving of the archive, we'd have the catalog of his library. And we're thinking of doing it in a kind of performative way, also in the sense that the cataloging act of cataloging would be happening in the open and would be accompanied maybe by commentary or some kind of oral engagement with people.
I mean, it's interesting that we're coming to these things that are very much active and engaging. And bringing it back to you, Khaled, and maybe then you want to comment as well on this. We talked about this difference between, another very important question for me was always about how can art and politics, the marriage of art and politics, be something that really produces a formula that retains poetics, retains the aesthetic experience, and is not just mere activism, or is not seen or derided as being just activist. And we talked about this difference about like reactionary art or gestures. Maybe you want to talk about specifically how your project is in relation to all these questions. Or let's say, or maybe accusations. I mean, because I know that you've heard this constantly. And how do you differentiate?
Well, I think the poetic experience is really a critical one, almost by definition. And it is a critique to an existing condition. In this particular case, it's a condition that's very violent. As an architect, I feel that there's a space for criticism just by sort of activating the tools of my discipline, drawing, making models, maybe even building buildings, although I'm not really sure there. But there's something to be said about the actual assembly of elements that actually produces a particular type of relationship to a site that I'm very interested in. Whether this is reactionary, well, I hope not. I'm definitely reacting to a condition, and I should probably not say I, because I'm working as part of a very large team of people, including designers and architects and artists who are professionals at what they do, but also architecture students, local community, a blacksmith. So people who have skills and knowledge that are usually very much part of space making, but are rarely acknowledged as sort of like major producers of space. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
How do you feel you're harnessing the poetic within your project?
I think in the forms in which it's being represented, whether photography or drawing, bookmaking, I think there will be a book element to this project.
Do you think it's interesting that the way this project actually beckoned towards you was through a certain poetic form, which was the image?
I've never really thought about it that way before. No, I think what beckoned me to this initially is that this kind of almost the poetry of survival. And not even survival, of maintaining a certain dignity within an everyday space. So it's a politics that is not a capital P, but a small p, but maybe with a very large E every day. And so somehow when people go out onto the streets and they demand freedom, bread, and dignity, all of which are very everyday things in a way, somehow the reaction is through the production of an architectural object, such as the water wheel. And the ability of such an object to actually produce a dignity, which is essentially for me, a poetic experience. And very sadly, in a context like that of the Ghouta, your very life is dependent on this dignity and this ability for these poetics to somehow exist.
And another question I have for you, and I know this is something that was heavily debated in even like juries, and your work is, I know a lot of NGOs that do these development projects. They use local craftsmen to do certain kind of survival technologies, or using scrap metal recycling to produce various alleviation to various communities all over the world. How how do you define the difference between what you're doing as an artistic intervention and that? What is the marked difference?
I think it has a lot to do with scale. I think it has a lot to do with intention.
Okay.
So, first of all, for the kind of work that I do to happen, it's a very, very personalized. There's a lot of trust involved, there's a lot of back and forth. I can't really imagine how it can operate on a larger scale. Like, I produce 2 windmills now, 2 wells last year. I don't really know how this can grow, really. The other thing is really the intention, like where the intention is to actually produce a poetic experience of some sort or an artistic one. I don't really know the difference there. And somehow how one can really imagine living their lives as a sort of like living, embodied, a vibrant work of art. It's not a vibrancy that is somehow grafted onto the work because it produces certain kinds of meaning. It's a vibrancy because it actually means something to the community that is there. And then what we do in places like Basel, Miami, is somehow try to then, or Marrakech, try to sort of like almost be inspired by this vibrancy and place it within a larger context of ideas and things that are happening in the world that we are interested in.
Yeah, I mean, when I was faced with that question about is this project development or is it an art project, and what I thought was also very brilliant is it is a development project. Maybe it is a development project, but how interesting is it that you can go in through the framework of art and appropriate that language and say, maybe this is what art needs to be. And I think that was the additional kind of voice for me within the capacity of this project, adding to the questions of what and how art should evolve. I think that was something that was very important. Maybe art should be about service to society, and maybe it should be about usability. And its usability harnessed with the creative effort and the poetics at the same time. So I think it allowed me to start to think, where does art want to go as well? So these are the questions that I really felt that it can be development, but what if development projects need to also evolve alongside the evolution of art itself and the languages of that?
Well, I think, so as we all know in this room, art is not just the exhibited object, but it's an entire series of institutions. And so initially when I started doing this, I very much imagined almost like an untapped financial potential within the art world, where my work would almost be an act of piracy per se for these different funding agencies. And sort of like if I was to sort of like formulate it as art, then maybe I could actually get some money to do this kind of work. And then B, like what could be more poetic than, I'm still sort of like amazed by what Omar was saying about literacy. What could be more poetic than actually teaching people how to read? Or giving children an access to a library? These are the most basic forms of poesis in a way that, particularly in a context where illiteracy is so high amongst women, for instance. Try to go to that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it goes both ways. That is to say, what I've realized is how much art has to learn from other contexts, right? There's stuff you can bring in the context of art, even if it's just by hijacking money that's available. But also, you know, take the case of, well, those open air lectures. I mean, what I've realized is that the different people, artists or academics who've come to speak, it's like their life was changed by the experience of encountering a different context and a different audience and having to think about their work otherwise, right? To see things otherwise, to see your own work and your own self otherwise. It could be a definition of art in a way, right? Of criticality. And a lot of them have written texts about that one lecture that they've done, which is like how many lecturers finish a lecture and then go write a text about the experience of having done the lecture, where it's just something they do all the time. So for me, it was really interesting to see how much it felt to them like they had learned something from
changing context, right? And Bornani, it's the same thing. This is somebody who had this huge library, whose work is, I think, in terms of writing, he's very much a writer and very much a filmmaker. He wasn't a writer who was making films or a filmmaker who was writing books. He was very much both, and other things as well. And his work, I think, is in dialogue with, the international work of literature and of film of his time, right? But at the same time, and so as much as he was in dialogue with the work of Pasolini or with the work of Orson Welles, he, throughout his life, felt that what he had most to learn from was these traditional arts in Morocco. That is to say, not traditional because they provide some kind of fixed form that was defined in the past, but precisely these traditional forms of art, because they are not institutionalized in a way, they are living and they are varied. They are constantly changing, and that is the value of them, and that is something that artists can and have to learn from.
Yeah. And I think, going back to also this idea of like how art and politics kind of work hand in hand together, and are a necessity. I feel at this stage there's an unavoidable nature of where we're going at for art not to respond to things that are happening around us. And for me, it was very interesting through the Marrakech Biennial to look at languages that are the material, look at form, and negotiate how form could become heavily imbued with societal needs and politics, and yet harness beauty and contemplation and criticality at the same time. But their accumulation through time and space really provides for a larger message and can actually be transformative for societies at large. I think some of the inspirational kind of stories was a lot of African American artists, which I think is an interesting link that I'm trying to draw on with in Africa, in Morocco in particular, and looking at the African American experiences, like an artist like Noah Purifoy that I mentioned earlier to you, is someone who used. This is a time in the 60s where, in the 60s, during the civil rights movement, and a lot of African Americans were suffering from lynchings and from their houses being burned. And here is an artist who writes a manifesto, calls on the importance of using the remnants of the burned houses to create art from it. It's a sort of and he advocated for that idea of, a way of living that form, creating that form from it. It's like the rising of the phoenix, right? And it becomes an even bigger statement of survival, and the potency and the poetics that he can harness in doing that becomes a bigger metaphor. And I think it's so interesting to look at the caveats of a lot of the worlds around us, be it in America itself with the African American community, or in Africa itself, or in the Arab world, in South Asia, in East Asia, where, legacies of decolonization, of starting to think about frameworks of liberation, and it continues to this day because these things are unresolved. I think this is what we're trying to reach at even here, that there are a lot of communities that are still depraved and deprived of basic necessities. But through the creative force and ideas in that, you give them a dignity, as you're very capable in saying and doing within your own projects. You're giving them a dignity to actually kind of equate themselves on a larger platform. So it's not just basic human rights that only development projects allow them, but it allows them for a higher platform that only art can actually give them, if that makes sense at all. And so I think we can end it at this. Thank you so much. Thank you, Khaled and Omar, for this wonderful panel.
Great.